Welcome to my part 2 of my 2-part series. Welcome to part 2 of what is probably a 2-part series on how to record car noises. In part 1, we kind of started simple with just running 2 mics into your camera directly. But what if you want to get a little more fancy and use up to 4 mics and have more manual control over it? Well, that's where something like this comes in. Separate audio recorder device. This is a Tascam DR70D. It's been out for several years. I think they have an updated version now, but there's all kinds of different recorders on the market. It means we'll have to do some different things with microphones, and I'm going to go over some simple setup tips on this, but it should be fun. So a recorder like this is great for a lot of different reasons. You have individual control over all the levels. You have different inputs. You can use XLR or TRS microphones. It even has 2 built-in stereo mics. You can mount it in different ways. It has a 1/4-inch thread on the top, a male and a female on the bottom. Or if you take this plate off, there's a cold shoe, so you can mount another accessory to it. And you can also plug in 3.5mm mics, just like we used in the last video. This will record 2 separate stereo files at once. So what you want to do is have one channel be panned all the way to the left and one panned all the way to the right, so we can control them separately after the fact. So as you can see, I have these set to either left all the way or right all the way. And then you want to make sure, depending on what kind of mic you're using, that the power requirement of that mic is met. So this can provide 48-volt phantom power or plug-in power for those little lav mics. So we'll get into that once we plug in all the mics. The other thing I want to mention is the sample rate. Video has a standard sample rate of 48 kilohertz, meaning 48,000 samples per second. And it's important that you keep it on that setting if you want to synchronize the video from your camera with the audio we capture here. Because on a longer clip, if it's the wrong sample rate, it could go out of sync. The other option is 44.1, and that's more of a standard for music recording. So if we wanted to run the same 2 mics that we used in part 1, it's these inexpensive lavalier mics inside foam blocks, run into a stereo breakout cable, and then this would be the input we would use because it's plug-in power, 5 volts roughly, which is what these kind of mics use. But I also just got a pair of these XLR lav mics with a long cable, so I won't even have to use an extension cable, which is great because you always want to reduce or eliminate as many connection points as you can, because those are all weaknesses. The other nice thing about XLR is that it's a much more secure connection and actually locks into place, so that's not going to fall out. If you want a great example of what not to do, here's about the dumbest setup possible, which is what I used to do. I ran my little lav mic into a 3.5mm to 1/4-inch adapter into a 1/4-inch to XLR adapter into my recorder. This is the worst possible way to do it because you're adding all these connections that can go wrong, and you're upsetting the amount of power that this mic wants. So pretty sure I ruined it. Learn from my mistakes, be less dumb. But in any case, we have a lot more flexibility with this type of setup, as you can see. So last time we used my Miata back there as a test dummy, but I've got something way more interesting in store in this video, and I hope I don't crash. Oh my God. Yes, behind me is my 1968 Mercury Cougar. This car has a long and interesting story behind it, which maybe I'll get into in a future video. But for now, what we're really interested in is we have a V8 with dual exhaust. So that means we have a good reason to run 2 mics to the back. And I think we'll start with a relatively simple setup where we get both sides of the exhaust, and then for the other two sources, we'll get an ambient interior shot. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, it's a little awkward to see, but you can tell I wedged my foam shield microphone between the valence and that bumper beam there. Then I ran the wire out this way, started taping it with gaffer tape to this body seam down here. Then up and around the wheel arch. My taping job is really pretty ugly, but I don't plan on going very far for very long, and gaffer tape's pretty strong. It's like a cross between masking tape in that it doesn't really hurt anything or leave residue, but it's almost as strong as duct tape, so it's really great stuff. And then here I switched to painter's tape, just because I'm very picky with this car, and I don't think gaffer tape would do anything to the paint, but I just thought masking tape was safer. And then being an old car with big gaps, it's not gonna hurt it to pinch this tiny little wire in the door jamb. And there's plenty left over, so we can easily run this to our recorder. My original plan was to come up through the package tray and into the trunk, but I remembered that there's some clips that hold this package tray in place, and you can't get to them unless you take the back seat out. So I decided to go around the outside, do whatever's easiest. As you can probably tell by now, running the wires and finding where to route them and secure them is by far the most annoying and time-consuming part of this whole process. So it's a good time to mention you can also use wireless microphones to do this. If you can figure out a way to securely mount them, get a couple like this, what I'm talking to you on. These little Rode Wireless Go mics are fantastic and very small, and they even come with a little fluffy windshield, but you would want to encase it in foam. This is the first gen, so you would need two separate receivers if you had two separate transmitters. But you could hook the receivers in to your recording device, and then you wouldn't have to worry about any of this obnoxious wire routing shenanigans. But unfortunately, I'm not that fancy yet, so I gotta deal with wires. Similar setup over here, wedged in between with some contingency tape. I also like to tape the mic wire at the end to the foam so it doesn't fall out. And brought over here, la-di-da, going along this line, up and over the wheel arch, and along this seam into the door. Well, finally got those mics run. That took a while, but we'll pick this up again tomorrow because it's getting kind of dark.
Tomorrow.
All right, pretty much ready to give this a go. The only thing I changed since yesterday was to add more tape along the wheel arches just to make sure it's nice and secure and not going to fall off and get snagged in the wheel and break my microphones I just bought. But yeah, let's get everything hooked up and see how this goes. Okay, so this is basically going to be the setup right here. I've got the recorder mounted on a little mini tripod here on the transmission tunnel just to help keep it from sliding around. If you're doing any kind of performance driving, you'll want to hard mount this a bit better. But anyways, I've got my two exhaust mics running straight into there. The left is input 1 and the right is number 2. And then for 3 and 4, I'm going to use the built-in mics that are on the back side of this, and we'll get a nice cabin stereo image. So that should be interesting. But first we need to set it up properly. So we go into the menu, basic, channel 1 is going to be left, and this needs to be set to XLR-TRS, and channel 2 as well, input gain, and this is where you tell it you want to use phantom power. So use 48 volts, so you say, are you sure? Yes. And then channel 2, yes. I'm going to turn off the limiter, Limiter's not a bad idea, but I'm going to go without it. And then we go back and tell it that channels 3 and 4, we want to use the built-in mic. And once again, channel 4 is all the way to the right, channel 3 is all the way to the left. And I almost forgot, you have to tell it that you want to record on that channel. Kind of important. So record on. And as we go along, I'll start the car up and do some revs, and we'll have to play with these levels a bit. Make sure they're nice and loud but not clipping, and these little red lights will come on if you're clipping, so that's pretty handy. Once we're happy with the settings, we can flip the hold switch on the side here, which means if one of these knobs gets bumped, it's not going to change your settings. So right away, you can see that 1 and 2 are much too loud. So we'll roll those down a bit. See his lights come on. You can see 3 and 4 down there, not too loud. One and 2 still a little bit too loud. Okay, let's raise up the interior mics a bit. Okay. Also, I wanted to mention, if you're recording video at the same time as audio with a separate recorder, you'll want some way to synchronize the two afterwards when you're editing. So you'll want to do basically your own slate, which is any kind of sudden loud noise, which is those things you see, the old-time movie clappers. The purpose of that is to synchronize audio and video. So when you have both going, do something like a clap or some sudden noise like that all the mics will pick up. And then when you're editing, you can see that as a big peak in the audio file, and then you can line them up that way. So anyways, I'm going to get the camera mounted up, hopefully in a cool spot, and we'll go for a little test ride, see how it sounds. Well, there's kind of a lot of traffic, so that wasn't too exciting, but hopefully we got some good sound samples. The other advantage of using a recorder like this is I can now plug in some headphones and play back what we just did and see if there's anything I want to change. So I'm going to do that. For the interior mics, I could hear my squeaky brake pedal, so maybe that's not going to be the greatest mix for this car. So why don't we try to put a couple in the engine bay? Okay, it took a little time to come up with a strategy, so I won't bore you with that whole process of figuring it out. But here's what I'm doing. I got one over here underneath this side of the shock tower brace, and encased in foam again, open cell. And the mic is pointing that way. And then routed the wire over this way. And I'll show you where it comes through after I show you the other one, which is in the equal spot on the other side, also pointing this way, secured underneath this brace. So it should be a pretty nice equal stereo image of the engine bay. And this wire comes through here. I ran it through this little factory clip here, And then I don't think I'll be able to get the camera down there, but I ran them both into a nice, perfect hole that I found in the firewall. They both just barely fit through, and then there it is. And then I taped them both down and tape this one over here too. Again, want to keep it away from things like the throttle linkage, which is over here, and any moving parts, and keep your distance from the hot engine. It does get pretty hot in here, so this should be enough space. And I'm curious what it's going to sound like in here, because engines a lot of time don't sound as good as you think they will. The carburetor makes kind of a whooshing noise as it sucks air, and you get the wash of the fan and everything. So I'm not sure how amazing this is going to sound, but it's all part of the experiment, right? So let's find out. My hair is a mess. So yeah, they come through the firewall. You can't really see where, but I was able to find it with my hand. And then I have them both plugged into my handy stereo breakout cable, which allows me to run two mics into one 3.5 millimeter TRS input. So we're going to plug that in, and we'll have 4 separate mics. And that is where that goes. One little detail that I forgot about: when I'm using this input, I have to route that to tracks 1 and 2. So that meant I had to switch my exhaust mics to tracks 3 and 4, which means I'm going to have to go in and change all my settings around so that 3 and 4 are set to XLR, and 1 and 2 are set to external power because they're powered mics. And then go to the input settings and set it so the phantom power is going to 3 and 4, but not 1 and 2. So, should be good to go now, but now I'm gonna have to refiddle around with all the levels. So I'm gonna start up the engine and do the same thing I did before. Okay, this is looking pretty decent. See, 1 and 2 are the engine, and 3 and 4 are the exhaust. You can see I'm still slightly peaking on the exhaust, but I have those turned down about as much as they'll go. So I think we're gonna have to live with that, but pretty happy with that. So let's go for a drive. Alright, well I just plugged in my headphones and had to listen to that, and from what I can tell it sounds pretty good. So like last time, I'll have to get it back and import it into the computer and play around with it a bit. So I'll probably show you some basic edits and put some clips together, but I think this was a really good example of what you can do with 4 different inputs. But we may not be done yet. I have a feeling there might be one more car in store that we can try this out on. The real question here is it worth the extra effort? Because if I learned anything in the last couple evenings I've been messing with this is way harder than just running 2 mics straight into the camera. But I think there might be some cases where it's worth it, and I think this is probably one of them. So let's keep going. Back to the studio.
3 weeks later.
I'm back, and I've done a different thing with my face. What do you think? I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Anyways, the main thing I want to show you in the edit without getting too bogged down here is just how to synchronize the camera with your audio recorder. So I've got the first clip loaded in. I'm going to get my headphones on and get my hair out of the way. So, remember when I said that you can clap or make an obvious loud noise to help you later? That's what this is right here. If you see this peak, that's when I clapped. So, I'm going to load in the 2 files from the recorder. And like I said, it records 2 separate audio files. So they will be perfectly synchronized to each other. We still have to line them up with the camera. So, we can see straight away that's where the clap is. And obviously the second one is from the interior recording. This wouldn't have worked too well if I was using all outside mics like on the second clip. But on this one, we can use that. So, select both of them and move them over and try to get close. That's pretty close. I need to trim the beginning. And by default, you can only zoom in this much, and you can only move things by an increment of 1 video frame, which is, in this case, 1/30th of a second. So that's not really enough to perfectly line this up. It's close enough if you're not going to use the audio from the camera. Your eye won't be able to tell that there's a slight millisecond delay between the video and the audio if you're not using the camera audio. But if you are, which I am in this case, I was surprised by how good the GoPro audio sounded on this clip. So I want to get this exactly lined up. So the trick for that is, in Premiere at least, you right-click the sequence and select Show Audio Time Units. Oh, sorry. Then you can move things in a much smaller increment and you can zoom in further. This only applies to audio though. You can still only move video by 1 frame, which makes sense, but audio you can move in much smaller increments. So we're going to look at the peaks and try to match them up as best as we can. I'm thinking that little valley right there should match with that valley, so let's make a tiny adjustment there. It's hard to get it spot on sometimes, but if we zoom back out and play it, it should just sound like one sound. It shouldn't sound like 2 separate things. And that sounds pretty good. The other thing I'm going to do is move forward to where the car is running. And if we zoom way in, we can actually see every pulse of the engine, which is pretty cool. Especially works well in this case because it's kind of a low V8 and it's got this very distinct waveform. So, since the GoPro, which is the top one, and the interior mics, which is this bottom one, we're in the same place, they should have pretty much the same waves. So I'm actually going to look at these and just try to dial it in as perfectly as I can. I'm seeing that there's some shorter and longer waves. So this looks like it's just about perfect. I just need to line up this valley with that valley. So let's see how small I can move it. That's pretty good. I can zoom in even further. I can move it by tiny amounts. And this looks pretty perfect to me. I'll gauge it by a couple other spots. Yeah, this looks spot on. So when we play it, it should all sound cohesive. Which it does. So the second thing I wanted to do with this clip was just show you each source independently, just so you get a sense for what they all sound like separately. So I'll move to this part where we're actually accelerating. Here they are together. Sounds pretty nice. We've got that little brake pedal squeak. Here it is. Why don't we do GoPro only? it sounds pretty good, and you get a pretty good sense of stereo space. So I like that. Next, just the exhaust, which we know is going to be good. That sounds amazing. Again, if you're only going to get one thing, I think the exhaust is pretty much the go-to. And then finally, the interior mics from the recorder. It's pretty mellow. I mean, you kind of get a sense of the gears whirring and kind of the cabin sound, so it's nice to add into the picture. The other thing that surprised me is that I was seeing the little red lights come on for the exhaust mics, and I was thinking they were too loud. But looking at this, there's still plenty of headroom. They were not too loud at all, so I'm not sure why those lights were coming on, but turns out we're totally fine. So don't even need to adjust the levels too much. With all of them together, let's look at the master meter. It's really pretty good. It's getting up to about -2 decibels, which you wouldn't want to go much higher than that anyway. So we could do some adjustments with the EQ like we did before and work on the road noise, or try to add more bass to the exhaust to really get that rumble. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with it. So I've already lined everything up for the second clip, and in this case, I couldn't use the GoPro audio because it was behind the window and there was a bunch of wind noise. So what you saw there was just the engine and exhaust mics, which sounded pretty good. I'll give you a sample though, let's check it out. Scroll down. Here is the GoPro by itself, and you'll see why I didn't use it in this case. That's kind of what I was expecting all along and got pleasantly surprised on the first clip. But the engine by itself, let's try that. Yeah, and this is kind of what I meant about engines not always sounding as good as you think they will or hope they will. You can hear a bit of a rattle, and I'm pretty sure I know what that is. There's kind of a heat tube that comes off of the exhaust manifold and hooks up to the air cleaner, and pretty sure that's what's rattling there. Anyway, exhaust by itself, obviously gonna sound good. Yeah, it's nice. So again, if I mute the GoPro and just have engine and exhaust together. It would actually be pretty good if it wasn't for that rattle. So if I did this again, I would either take that heat riser off or try to tighten it somehow. But that's worth keeping in mind when you go out there. Try to get rid of any of those rattles. Well, that's pretty much all I wanted to show you, is just how to sync everything up. And just like before, if you're not using this video that we shot, or even if you are, you can still take these audio samples that we've captured and apply it to other clips. So once again, I did the same thing and just went out with a friend and stuck a GoPro on his car and just did some basic driving around to get some exterior shots to add in to get it more interesting. So if you remember the Opal from part 1, that little yellow car that was in the background, I think I am going to use it for a third and probably final part to this series, where we kind of bring together everything we've learned and record a nice variety of sources from it while we're driving up the mountain, beautiful scenic road, and try to put together a whole edited sequence with different camera angles and show how to take those same audio clips and mix them differently for the different camera angles and make a cool kind of cinematic sequence out of it. So stay tuned for that, should be fun.